It seems sensible from this to assume that there is always an audience for fantastic and marvelous tales. And in fact, if one looks back at the historical record, it makes far better sense to try and trace a continuity of an audience of this kind than it does to try and trace some kind of literary genealogy in which a writer of one generation, specializing in or dabbling in marvel tales, influenced directly a writer of the following generation.
Throughout the 20th century, literature has reflected and influenced the society that surrounded it. Dystopian literature, in particular, illustrated the discontent and issues within the system. Although the genre had been present for many years, it began to build popularity in the 1920s, following World War I. Driven by economic surplus, the Roaring Twenties began with revolutions in music and the woman's sphere on a global scale. This revolution spawned a new culture. However, societal tensions increased with nativism and bootlegging prohibited liquor. These corruptions produced the Lost Generation literary movement. T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, emphasized the dualistic view of society. He condemned the lack of communication and the overwhelming of senses. He also depicted a dystopian future of the fall of great cities. Also, at this time, Evgeny Zalmanin's novel, We, was the first to express a strong fervor against a totalitarian regime. This novel rebelled against the great extent of communism.
One evening as the sun went down and the jungle fire was burning, down the track came a hobo hiking, and he said, "Boys, I'm not..."
After an economic crash, the Great Depression consumed the nation. In addition, the Dust Bowl damaged crops, which diminished food surpluses. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt attempted to counteract the crises through various government-funded agencies. America's decline was only part of the worldwide state. Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World, illustrated the faults of a utopian society. His novel described a world driven by science rather than morals.
All the day long, where the rain does shine.
With the beginning of World War II, the woman's sphere expanded, creating the independent role of Rosie the Riveter. While America began to fight the war against communism, corruption continued throughout the government. Through FDR's Executive Order 9066, he pursued the Japanese Americans on their connection to their mother country. In addition, unjust trials were held against those with associations with communism. In George Orwell's novel, Animal Farm, he discussed the decrease in human morality and the barbaric nature of man. After the war, Orwell's novel, 1984, portrayed a society where the government has unrestricted access to one's thoughts. The idea of a big brother government has transcended the novel and is often referred to in common culture.
The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
The 1950s were defined by cultural conformity. This included Joseph McCarthy's banning of books that challenged society. On the other hand, consumerism was at an all-time high. In addition, with the end of World War II, the woman's sphere had dwindled into a domestic role. Foreign conflicts ensued with Korea and the Cold War. However, this conformity was challenged through all types of media, such as literature and music. In 1952, Kurt Vonnegut's novel, Player Piano, described a world defined by machinery and consumerism, challenging the change of society at the time. A year later, Ray Bradbury's novel, Fahrenheit 451, revolted against conformity, explaining the loss of culture. In 1954, William Golding's novel, Lord of the Flies, questioned the morality of humans and our societal structures.
Number 9. Number 9.
The 1960s focused on the individual's journey to understand and express their cultural identity. Dissatisfied with America's involvement with the Vietnam War, the hippies emerged in retaliation. As well, minority groups fought for cultural equality. The feminist movement took full force with Betty Friedan's feminine mystique. Meanwhile, the African American civil rights movement gained a greater following. Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange discussed the duality of good and evil. Through depicting violent young gangs, Burgess notes the corruption of society and government.
I heard talk in the 1960s of the possibility of getting these young thugs and not putting them in jail, because jails were needed for professional criminals, but rather putting them through a course of conditioning, turning them in effect into clockwork oranges. No longer organisms full of sweetness and colour and light like oranges, but machines. I feared this, and that's why I wrote the novel.
In the 60s and 70s, John Brynner reached the peak of his popularity for his many novels. This period was defined by the identity movements, the violence that was associated with them, the new drug culture, and a credibility gap between the government and its people. His novel, Stand on Zanzibar, predicted a population of 7 billion people by the time of 2010, in a community which would be driven by mass-marketed drugs and mundane genetic engineering. In Jagged Orbit and Shockwave Rider, Brynner reflected the credibility gap by concentrating on controlled information by the government. As well, he envisioned a future controlled by drugs, violence, and interracial tensions. In 1972, Brynner wrote The Sheep Look Up, about a world destroyed by pollution gases.
With what's been so often termed the new wave in science fiction, I'd like to underline one extremely important point. Before one breaks the rules in a field where giants have walked, one must know why those rules were created in the first place.
Following the end of the Vietnam War, in the 1970s, Nixon promoted a policy of détente in order to help mend societies. While Nixon attempted to improve foreign relations, the economic situation in the nation suffered greatly from extreme stagflation and a deepening credibility gap. In Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, The Lathe of Heaven, she comments on the malaise feeling of Americans by writing about a character who attempts to create a better society where dreams come true.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The decade of the 1980s was characterized by the major changes in economic policy, such as the Reagan Revolution. Reagan revolutionized economics by focusing on the trickle-down theory and strengthening America's defense. Reagan was largely supported by white, upper-class Southern Protestants, which was illustrated in The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. In her novel, she focused on a society run by corrupt, monotheocratic leaders, where women had even less rights than in reality. Atwood also predicted the Islamic tensions that we experience today. With the end of the Cold War, the culture wars emerged in the 1990s. This period was defined by issues concerning abortion, gun policies, separation of church and state, privacy, recreational drugs, censorship, and homosexuality. In Lois Lowry's novel, The Giver, the author created a perfect society in which none of these harsh realities could ever occur. However, through expressing the lack of human emotion, Lowry reveals that these conflicts are necessary to create change in society. While The Giver focuses on the absences of controversy, Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age centers on a plethora of ethical issues. Stevenson emphasizes the use of nanotechnology, social class, and education. Dystopian literature is still prevalent today and seen in popular novels such as Divergent, Hunger Games, Uglies, The Host, Maze Runner, and World War Z. In the present, authors continue to present the negative possibilities of the upcoming future. With the consuming nature of the technological age and the broadening of moral standards, one is forced to acknowledge the fulfilled prophecies conceived by prior dystopian authors. However, will the current dystopian depictions of tomorrow become the reality of today? Read between the lines. The answer may be right in front of you.
Our present and our past overlap, and so too does our future. And it's been very rightly said, it behooves us all to be interested in the future because that is where we're going to spend the rest of our lives.